You're not ready for what I'm about to say, but you need to hear it. Since 2020, the US has printed more money than in the first 240 years of its existence. The M2 money supply jumped by over 40% in just 24 months. Federal debt exploded past $34 trillion, rising $1 trillion every 100 days in 2024 alone. Foreign countries are dumping US's treasuries. China's holdings are down 40% since 2013, and for the first time ever, the Federal Reserve is the largest buyer of its own government's debt. This is how every global reserve currency dies. It starts with dominance, then trade surpluses, then pride, then money printing, then collapse. It's happened 4 times already. Portugal, the Netherlands, Britain, now the U.S., each thought they were different. None were. And right now, in 2025, the dollar is deep into stage 6 of the same exact 7-stage death spiral. If you're holding dollars, your wealth is already evaporating. Slowly at first, then suddenly. Let me show you how it ends. Stage 7, replacement and collapse. The silent coup. Nobody rings a bell when a reserve currency dies. There's no funeral, no announcement from the IMF, no alert on Bloomberg that says global finance just changed forever. Instead, it vanishes in silence, one trade deal at a time, one bond auction at a time, one central bank decision at a time. By the time the world acknowledges a new standard, the transition is already over. And that's the brutal truth about Stage 7. It's over before anyone tells you it's happening. Take a hard look at the dollar's trajectory in 2025. We're already seeing trade settle in yuan between China and the Gulf states. Argentina's buying Chinese machinery not in dollars but in yuan. Kenya's importing Russian oil with UAE dirhams. But the real signal comes from the bond markets. In 2024, for the first time in modern history, foreign purchases of U.S. treasuries turned negative on a net basis. Let that sink in. The world is not just buying fewer treasuries, they're outright selling them. And who's picking up the slack? The Federal Reserve itself, through shadow QE. We are monetizing our own debt because nobody else wants it. Now ask yourself, what happens when the very foundation of American economic dominance, the assumption that there's infinite global demand for dollar-denominated debt, no longer holds? You get what Japan faced in 1990, but on steroids. A currency collapse isn't always hyperinflation. Sometimes it's loss of utility. The dollar doesn't have to go to zero. It just needs to stop being useful for global trade. And that's what we're seeing now. India and Russia are settling oil in rupees. BRICS are forming a clearinghouse for cross-border payments outside SWIFT. And central banks are hoarding gold like it's 1971. Last year alone, they bought 1,037 metric tons of gold, the largest annual increase since records began. That's not diversification, that's evacuation. So when does Stage 7 happen? It's already happening. Not in a single crash, but in the crumbling of the scaffolding that once made the dollar inevitable, in the slow, irreversible death of default demand. In the moment when a Saudi oil trader or a Vietnamese steel importer picks something else over dollars and no one even flinches. That's Stage 7. That's collapse. Not with a bang, but a shift so quiet, you only notice it in hindsight, right after your savings just lost half their global value. Stage 6. Loss of confidence and search for alternatives. The unraveling has already begun. You'll know you're in Stage 6 when the world stops asking how many dollars they need and starts asking how to get rid of the ones they've got. This isn't a theory anymore. It's a data point. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 71% in 1999 to just 58.4% in 2024. That's the lowest in modern history, and the rate of decline is accelerating. It took 20 years to lose 10 points. It only took 4 years to lose the next 3. Central banks are dumping treasuries, buying gold, and quietly cutting bilateral trade deals to bypass the dollar entirely. The media calls this de-dollarization, but don't let the buzzword dull the knife. This is an existential vote of no confidence. $1 trillion balance sheet at a time. China, for instance, isn't just trading oil in yuan. It's building a cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, a direct rival to SWIFT. And it's not a toy. As of 2025, over 100 countries have registered banks using CIPS. Brazil and Argentina proposed a Latin American regional currency. ASEAN nations are settling trades in ringgit, baht, and rupiah. This is the financial equivalent of NATO allies stockpiling Russian weapons. The institutions that once guaranteed dollar supremacy are starting to hedge against it. Even the Bank for International Settlements warned in its 2024 bulletin that the era of a singular reserve currency may be over, and the private sector is following suit. As of this year, less than 50% of SWIFT transactions are settled in dollars, the first time in history that number has fallen below half. This is stage 6 in full swing. But here's the kicker: Americans don't see it, because it happens outside our borders. The average American has never had to think about currency risk. But foreigners do. If you're a Turkish importer, a Malaysian central banker, or a Nigerian oil trader, the volatility of the dollar is no longer just annoying. It's dangerous. It's unpredictable. And so they hedge, not because they know exactly what replaces the dollar, but because they know what doesn't. A currency backed by $34 trillion in debt and political gridlock so severe, the U.S. nearly defaulted in 2023 over the debt ceiling debate. Stage 6 is when confidence dies quietly, not with panic, but with planning. The search for alternatives isn't just happening, it's already producing results. And if you wait until your 401k shows the effects, you're already 2 stages too late. Stage 5. Currency debasement and money printing. The invisible theft. You want to know when a country enters stage 5? It's when printing money becomes a policy tool, not a last resort. It's when debt isn't managed, it's monetized. And when that happens, the reserve currency stops being a store of value and becomes a weapon turned inward, used to steal quietly from its own citizens. And here's the truth: nobody in Washington wants to say out loud, the United States is already there. Since the pandemic began, the M2 money supply, cash, checking deposits, and easily convertible near money has exploded by over $6.3 trillion. That's a 40% increase in less than 3 years, the fastest monetary expansion in American history outside of total war. And where did all that new money go? Into asset bubbles, into inflation, into your grocery bill. That's how currency debasement works in a fiat system. There's no silver content to reduce like in the old days. There's no gold backing to dilute, so they just add zeros to digital ledgers at the Federal Reserve. And you pay for it at the gas station, at the rent office, at the pharmacy. You think a 17% increase in food prices from 2020 to 2023 is just supply chain issues. No, it's a feature of stage 5. The American government isn't hiding this. In 2022, the White House publicly bragged that its policies reduced the federal deficit by $1.3 trillion. But here's the fine print. The reduction was relative to emergency COVID spending, not actual debt paydown. In reality, the national debt rose by $2.5 trillion in that same year. You were lied to. They told you the deficit shrank, but they financed new debt by having the Fed buy treasury bonds in the open market. That's monetization. That's printing money to cover spending. And the worst part? Most Americans cheered. Free stimulus checks, forgiven PPP loans, extended unemployment benefits. But nothing is free. You paid for it by losing 25% of your purchasing power in 3 years. This is how all reserve currencies die at stage 5. Not with screaming, but with applause. And the world sees it. Japan is selling U.S. treasuries to defend the yen. China hasn't added to its dollar reserve since 2018. When foreigners stop wanting your debt, you're left printing money to cover your own deficits. And once you cross that line, history has no mercy. Stage 4, deficit spending and living beyond means the great delusion. Every empire dies the moment it starts mistaking consumption for production. Stage 4 is the illusion of prosperity, the dangerous high before the crash. This is when a reserve currency nation becomes addicted to its own status. It doesn't just run deficits, it builds an entire economy around them. And that's exactly where the United States has lived for the past 50 years. Let me give you a number. $20.30 trillion. That's the total accumulated trade deficit of the United States since 1976. That's not a rounding error. That's 1 full year of GDP spent on buying more than we produce, year after year, decade after decade. And it didn't happen by accident. It was policy. It was strategy. Americans were told they didn't need to manufacture, just manage. Let the factories move to China. Let Mexico make your car parts. Let Vietnam sew your clothing. We'll be the idea people. We'll sell financial products, brand consulting, Hollywood movies, but here's the problem. You can't outsource your production and still expect to be the world's economic center. That's not a plan. That's a fantasy. and Washington bought into it wholesale. Instead of investing in domestic production, we doubled down on entitlements and endless war. Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security make up over 60% of the federal budget. Add defense spending, and there's barely room left for actual investment. And how do we pay for all of it? Not with surpluses, not with real growth. We borrow, trillions every year. And when we can't borrow enough from the world, we borrow from the future. That's why interest payments on the national debt surpassed $1 trillion in 2024, more than the defense budget. We're not funding a country anymore. We're funding a Ponzi scheme, and the rest of the world knows it. That's why they're backing away. That's why the Saudis are taking yuan for oil. That's why France's Macron is urging Europe to reduce dollar exposure. This isn't a fiscal debate anymore, it's an exit strategy. In stage 4, the nation still believes it's rich, but it's spending its savings, not creating new wealth. And when the lights finally go out, there's no one left with the tools to fix the engine. Because the factories are in Guangzhou, the steel is in Turkey, and the chips are in Taiwan. America lives on imports, paid for with IOUs. But history doesn't honor IOUs forever. Stage 3, reserve currency status formalized. The peak of power. Stage 3 is the summit, the moment when a currency isn't just widely used, but institutionally required. It's not just the medium of exchange. It becomes the unit of account for global contracts, commodities, debt, and reserves. It's the moment the world stops questioning your value and starts anchoring itself to you. And for the United States, that moment was July 1st, 1944, Bretton Woods. 44 nations, shattered by war and desperate for stability, agreed to make the US dollar the cornerstone of the post-war financial order. Every major currency was pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. And just like that, the United States became the world's banker, insurer, and enforcer all at once. But here's the part no one talks about. Stage 3 is not where the trouble starts. It's where the inevitability begins. Because formal reserve status doesn't just create demand, it creates dependence, and dependence leads to imbalance. With the world now needing dollars for trade and reserves, America had to export more dollars than it brought in. That meant the U.S. had to run persistent trade deficits, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. That's the Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who warned in 1960 that the dollar's role as reserve currency was incompatible with long-term fiscal health. And he was right. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves had dropped by over 60% as nations like France demanded gold in exchange for their dollars. Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar became fiat. But the system didn't collapse. It mutated. The petrodollar system, established with Saudi Arabia in 1974, forced the world to keep using dollars, even though the gold was gone. Every barrel of oil sold globally had to be priced in dollars, and to buy oil, you needed U.S. debt. It was elegant. It was brilliant. It was also the beginning of stage 4. Because once the world needs your currency more than your goods, you stop producing goods. You start producing debt. That's the real cost of stage 3. The reserve currency becomes a trap. It turns productive nations into rent-seeking giants, living off privilege instead of output. It happened to Britain. It happened to the Dutch. And by the 1980s, it was happening to us. Stage 3 feels like immortality, but it's just the start of the fall. Stage 2, massive trade surpluses and global wealth accumulation. The harvest years. Stage 2 is the golden age. The empire has emerged from war, from revolution, from collapse or conquest, and now it begins the harvest. Not by force, but by trade. By providing the world with something it desperately needs. Finished goods, cutting-edge technology, or rare commodities. This isn't about privilege yet. It's about value. And for the United States, this era began in 1945. The war had flattened Europe and Asia. Industrial plants in Dresden, Nagoya, and Manchester were smoldering rubble. But America's factories were humming. Detroit wasn't just making cars. It was building tanks, bombers, and B-29s. When the war ended, that industrial base didn't stop. It pivoted. It started churning out automobiles, refrigerators, steel, textiles, and electronics. From 1945 to 1970, the U.S. ran consistent trade surpluses with nearly every major economy on Earth. We exported more than we imported. We sold real things for real money. The dollars that flooded into Europe and Asia were backed by machinery, know-how, and physical productivity. And what did we do with the surplus? We lent it. The Marshall Plan alone provided $13 billion in aid to rebuild Europe. That's over $160 billion in today's dollars. But it wasn't charity, it was strategy. Those dollars came back home as demand. Europe rebuilt with American equipment, ran their economies on American capital, and bought American goods. Japan's post-war miracle? Built on U.S. investment and U.S. markets. Germany's industrial renaissance? Made possible by trade surpluses with a dollar-hungry world. These were the years when the world ran on American exports, and not just physical goods but trust. Trust that a dollar paid today would hold its value tomorrow. But here's the truth about stage 2. It never lasts. Prosperity breeds comfort. Comfort breeds complacency. And eventually, you start consuming more than you produce. You offload the dirty work. You move factories abroad. You financialize your economy, because making money from money feels easier than making things. And slowly, the trade surpluses vanish. The industrial base erodes. By the 1980s, the U.S. began importing more than it exported, and the surplus became a deficit. But for a while, the memory of those harvest years created an illusion that the dollar was strong because it was destined to be. In reality, it was strong because America built things the world needed. And when we stopped doing that, the countdown began. Stage 1. Military dominance and control of trade routes. The Iron Foundation. Before any of the wealth, before the deficits, the money printing or the collapse, there's only one thing that matters: control of the physical world. The oceans. The trade choke points. The routes that move raw materials and finished goods across continents. Every single reserve currency in history began the same way, with overwhelming military dominance that made commerce impossible without their permission. For Portugal, it was the caravels and galleons patrolling the Cape of Good Hope and the Indian Ocean. For the Dutch, it was the VOC and its private navy controlling the Straits of Malacca. For Britain, it was the Royal Navy, more powerful than the next 5 navies combined, which turned the Suez Canal, Singapore and Gibraltar into toll booths for global trade. And for the United States? It was 1945 and 6,993 warships flying the Stars and Stripes. America didn't just win the war. It inherited the sea. The U.S. Navy established bases in Guam, Okinawa, Bahrain, Diego Garcia, Rota, and Subic Bay, placing every major shipping lane under American oversight. Today, the U.S. still operates 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, a level of force projection unmatched by any empire in history. To put that into perspective, China has 2, Russia has 1, and it barely floats. But it's not just about hardware. It's about geography. The U.S. Navy has a permanent presence in every key choke point: the Strait of Hormuz, which controls oil from the Gulf; the Strait of Malacca, through which 1/3 of global trade passes; the Suez Canal, connecting Europe and Asia; the Panama Canal, linking the Pacific and Atlantic. No cargo moves globally without touching waters. America dominates. That's why the dollar became indispensable. Not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by gunships and global security guarantees. You want to trade oil? Do it in dollars. You want freedom of navigation? Use the dollar. The world accepted dollar dominance, not just out of trust, but out of necessity. But here's the problem. Dominance breeds dependence, and dependence creates fragility. As new powers rise, China, India, regional blocs, they're building alternatives: naval bases, energy corridors, digital currencies, and once the monopoly on trade routes erodes, so does the foundation of the reserve currency. That's the start of the pattern. The U.S. built an empire on aircraft carriers and Bretton Woods. But history says even the mightiest navies can't stop a currency once it begins to slide. If you're still watching, then you already know, this isn't just about the dollar. It's about your savings, your retirement, your paycheck, your time. You've spent your entire life working for dollars. But what if those dollars no longer work for you? In 2000, $1 bought what now costs $1.79. In 2020, a median home cost $320,000. In 2025, it's pushing $450,000. Eggs up 86%. Rent up 40%. The money hasn't grown weaker. It's been systematically gutted, quietly, relentlessly. And now the world is responding. Global central banks bought 1,037 metric tons of gold last year, the highest level on record. Not because they're guessing. Because they're exiting. They see it. They've seen it before, because every reserve currency dies the same way. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. It takes everything down with it. Your pension? Denominated in dollars. Your bank account? Denominated in dollars. Your 401k, your annuity, your salary, your savings, they're all bound to a currency that's already unraveling. Slowly at first, then all at once. Ask yourself this. If you knew you were living through the final stage of the world's dominant currency, what would you do differently? Because this is not theoretical, it's mathematical. The same math that crushed the Portuguese real, the Dutch guilder, and the British pound is crushing the dollar. The same debt curve, the same trade imbalances, the same loss of confidence. And once stage 7 hits, replacement and collapse, you won't get a second warning. You'll wake up and the dollar won't work the way it used to. The price of everything will shift. Your wealth will shrink, not because you did anything wrong, but because you were holding the wrong thing at the wrong time. This isn't about doom. It's about clarity. The pattern is real. The timeline is here. The death of the dollar is not a question of if. It's a question of how fast. Diversify. Exit the system before it exits you. Because by the time the headlines catch up, the collapse is already done.